Welcome back. I hope you all get charged up for the afternoon session. Up next, Mr. Josh Arboran, Postmaster at Twitter, will tell us about growth hacking with messaging in modern application. Mr. Arboran, please.
Good afternoon. Thank you. Slides up. Yeah, it's great to be back here at WIDS. I was here last year, and I thank the Internet Society for bringing me back. We're going to talk about growth hacking and messaging. I'll probably have one of the least technical talks of these set of sessions here today, but hopefully you'll find it valuable. I'm Josh. I'm with Twitter these days. Originally, I joined Twitter when they acquired a startup I'd been running for about 3 years called REST Engine. REST Engine was a marketing automation solution for Facebook apps. Similar to what a Marketo, say, does for Salesforce data, we did for all the data that Facebook made available to the apps. Twitter acquired us actually 2 years ago this month, and glad to be there. It's a great company. It's been quite an eye-opening experience working at Twitter. I have about 18 years I've been in Silicon Valley in the Bay Area working at various startups. Indeed, Twitter is the largest company I've ever worked for. So at Twitter, I am the postmaster, and I get asked a lot, what is the postmaster, what's the role there? And so I work on all things messaging. Twitter is a big sender of messaging. On a light Twitter day, we might send, for example, a few 100 million emails and say a few 100 million push notifications. On a busy day, if Twitter's being used a lot, those numbers can get well above 1 billion. And so we send a lot of messaging that requires quite a stack. I work as a product manager on that stack. I maintain relationships with the various ISPs and message receivers out there in the world. And I also work on our messaging security, which we consider very important, and making sure that there's no trying to stop spam on the platform, especially spam that might escape into our outbound messaging. And so that's the postmaster role at Twitter. Now, I'm going to talk about a couple things. First, I'm going to talk about messaging, and then I'm really going to talk about growth hacking. And you'll see why these are connected in a moment. So as I'm sure most of this audience knows, messaging is a pretty hot field right now. You may have heard of a company called WhatsApp that did pretty well for themselves in the past couple years. And I'll get back to this in a second, but I'm curious, who here is a WhatsApp's user? Can I have a show of hands? So pretty much most people, maybe 90% of everyone here. There's other big plays in the messaging space right now. Viber was acquired by Rakuten recently for nearly $1 billion. Who here's a Viber user? Okay, so there's some, maybe 20% or so. Tango is another messaging play that's recently took quite a lot of VC money. Anyone here a Tango user? Okay, a couple Tango users over there. Must have some colleagues in other countries that you're trying to do voice communication with there. So messaging is hot. Why is messaging so hot right now? Why is all this money pouring into the messaging space? Why would Facebook spend $19 billion to acquire WhatsApp? What is it, a 3-year-old company? Well, there's a number of different reasons. And one is user growth is through the roof. And when you talk about messaging, user growth is through the roof in both the sense of these apps are gaining a lot of users, but also other apps are learning that they can use messaging to drive their own user growth. And that's really how I'm going to talk about messaging. Messaging is also in another way becoming kind of the new platform for a lot of our internet activities. So we've had this case where the social networks have been very dominant in the past few years, and messaging has really upended that, in that messaging is now a way that content is discovered, that e-commerce is conducted. It's a way that you might find media, that someone might share apps with you, might share games with you. And of course, if someone shares an app with you and then you go ahead and download and install that app, well, that app's just driven growth through messaging. Messaging is the next wave of commerce, I like to say a lot. That's really why I say Rakuten acquired Viber, is really to drive the commerce. WeChat, my understanding, is just taken off as an e-commerce platform over in China. I guess it's almost impossible now to hail a taxi without using WeChat. They'll actually turn down fares if you try and pay with cash because they want you to pay with WeChat. So messaging is definitely very hot. It's driving user growth, and it's becoming fundamental to all these other kind of activities that are happening out on the internet. Now, as I mentioned already, this is both true for true pure messaging apps, but it's also true for apps that aren't necessarily messaging apps, but can benefit a lot from messaging. And one of the great ways apps can benefit from messaging is growth hacking. So so there's a lot of messaging players out there. I don't know, we need to really kind of cover that. There are some different categories, and I'm actually going to focus on 3 of these categories. So just to mention, of course, email is a big category. Now, I want to ask, who here has an email address? Pretty much everyone, right? And I think that's pretty much the only case where everyone will raise their hands. Everyone is getting some kind of push for sure. Direct messaging, we talked about that, the voice stuff, gaming apps. Of course, all these lines are also blurring quite a lot as these different messaging players get into each other's space. For example, Tango was very much a voice app, but now it's, say, going after WhatsApp. So I'm going to really talk about growth hacking. And growth hacking has got a lot of attention these days. It's been a big focus in Silicon Valley. And growth hacking is very important, and you can do a lot with growth hacking. But there's one point to make up front with growth hacking if you're an app developer. Growth hacking comes after product market fit. Right? If you're just launching your product, if you're just creating it and you don't know what your customers want, you're not focused on growth yet. You're focused on product market fit. So I hear this a lot where companies are immediately kind of going to these growth hacking programs rather than getting the product market fit right first. So I'm going to be talking about growth hacking. I'm not going to really talk about product market fit. There's lots of great books on that. But if you don't yet have your product market fit, don't spend your time worrying about growth. Now, if you do have a product market fit and you have something that customers want, that customers need, that you see them using it already, then it's time to start talking about growth. How do you take that to more customers? And that's really what growth hacking is all about. So when you talk about the growth hacking messaging arsenal, it's really focuses on 3 main messaging techniques: email, push, and SMS. Now, you notice the voice isn't in there because if you tried to do growth hacking with voice, you would just annoy your users to no end. And so it really comes down to these 3 messaging techniques when you talk about growth hacking through messaging. Now, I want to talk about email first. I'm just going to kind of cover this. Email is old school. Email's been around forever. If you take a look at the history of email and you think about like the early mainframe systems, you can say email's been around since the 50s. Now, the first ARPANET, early internet emails were late 60s, but email's a very old school protocol, but everyone has it. And that's one of the benefits of email. Email is also very cheap. It's inexpensive to send email, and so that's a great way to reach people. It also gives you a lot of flexibility. With email, you're able to control the message very much. You can create rich messages. You can put media inside these messages. So you have a ubiquitous channel. Everyone's got an email address. You can message them through it, and you can create rich messaging. That makes it for a wonderful channel, and is one of the reasons that email is really one of the primary ways that growth hacking is done. Indeed, there's a number of growth hacking as a service startups that have started in the Bay Area, and every one of them is launched with email first. So I bring this to your attention because a lot of times app developers say, I don't want to think about email, it's a push world, it's a mobile world. Well, actually, these days email is a mobile channel, right? Who here reads the email on their phone? Yeah, most everyone. Email is a mobile channel, and it's the mobile channel that gives you the most flexibility. You can put rich media into your email. Of course, then there's push. Push is a great channel also. The real limitation when you talk about push is that you already have to have the app installed. Right? I can only send you a push message if you've already installed my app. And so that's great, but it's also limiting. So that tends to mean when you talk about growth hacking, that push is used more for things like engagement and driving up engagement, but not really used for acquisition because you can't send a push message to someone if you don't already have them on your app. Push is also great in that you do have some flexibility. When you take a look at, say, Android push, you can put images in there. You can kind of control the look and feel of the push. You can actually put actions into your push messages, and that's great. It's also somewhat limited. You can't put a video into a push. You can't put a form. So there's some advantages to push. There's also some limitations. And then there's SMS. And SMS, in some cases, is a great channel. There's certain countries where, say, Twitter growth is very much driven by SMS. There's a lot of challenges, especially if you're an early app developer, with using SMS in that the primary one being that it's very expensive. Right? The carriers have tremendous markup on SMS. Indeed, that's been one of the main reasons WhatsApp has become so popular, is because it avoids those fees. It basically gives you SMS without the fees. So SMS is an interesting channel to look at. It can be very expensive, though. It's also very limited. You don't get a lot of control. You don't have a lot of space to put a message. You can't put any images in there. You can't format HTML. And generally, when you look at growth hacking programs, a lot of people will focus on email first, then focus on push, and then, if it makes sense, focus on SMS. So let's talk about growth hacking. And if I was going to sum it up in one kind of sentence, I would say growth hacking is about giving your prospects or your users content as a pretext for a conversation. So content can be anything from what you're at, like Twitter content, tweets, Facebook content, posts, social engagements. And that's really what growth hacking is about. And so if you're going to give content and you're going to make it share, what can you share? And I've just thrown up a few examples of this. I mean, at Twitter, one of the ways we've driven growth, for example, through email, is we made it easy to share a tweet by email. If you're using, this was actually something we saw on our mobile platform. People were taking tweets and on their phones sharing them by email. So we actually made that simpler. We built it into the desktop version, we built it into the mobile version. It's super easy if you want to take a tweet and share it by email. And that's been a great growth driver. But other companies like Spotify has been really good about sharing playlists, making them available for growth hacking. The game companies are actually some of the best at growth hacking. I mean, they live and die by analytics and have gotten very good about what they can share. You know, your friend reached this level, don't you want to try and one-up them and get to that level too, kind of stuff. Recipes, pins from Pinterest, apps, photos, these are all things that can share. Memes, cutesy cartoons, coupons, deals, dollars. Make no mistake, dollars, if you have them, are a great way to drive growth. Indeed, my understanding is that why WeChat has really taken over the taxi market in China is because they pay the taxi drivers. If the taxi drivers take their payment via WeChat, WeChat adds on some extra yen on top of that. So that's been very powerful. You look at other companies in Silicon Valley, like PayPal, huge giant today. PayPal's original growth model was $10. Sign up for PayPal, you get $10. Now that's great, but it only works if you have the kind of money to burn in that way, and most app developers don't really have that. But there's other things you can share: tweets, content, photo. So one of the things with growth hacking is to start to think about, what does your app do? What is it that your users would want to share that would bring other users into your app, or bring users back to your app? I like to say that there's a growth hack and prime directive, if I can follow up on the Star Trek analogies we had earlier today. But when you talk about growth hacking, you first have to know that product market fit. You have to know what the value is for your users, why they're using your app. Once you have that product market fit, make sure you understand it. To be perfectly honest, I think that was one of a challenge of early Twitter employees. I mean, Twitter kind of took off and it was hard to understand. It was hard to explain what was the value of Twitter. We've gotten a lot better at that over time. Indeed, our users actually really did it for us. Things like a tweet, the whole word tweet came from users. The @handle, the hashtag, these all came from users. And those provided a way that we as employees at Twitter could better understand what was going on at Twitter. But your real prime directive with growth hacking is understand that product value and then design experiments around that to isolate the cause and effects, the levers that you can pull that will control that product value and get your users to share it with other people. A great example of that is, this is true for both Facebook and Twitter, is the number of connections you have. If you have a lot of friends on Facebook, you're much less likely to churn. Facebook has actually put out a number of studies about this, which I think they actually knew the exact number, that when you hit this number, you're very unlikely to ever churn by Facebook. So what did they do? They created all kinds of things where they send you an email saying, here's some friends that you probably know, add them on Facebook. Incredibly successful program. And so when you look at growth hacking, your prime directive is, what's the value, what's your product market fit, and start experimenting around that. Because often, even if you understand the value, how you can manipulate that value, change it, make it easy to share, that really takes experimentation. And that's very much an analytical moment. And what you're looking for in that analysis is that aha moment, where you can create something where your users get it, they finally understand, and they want to take that to other users and bring other users back. If you can find that, you'll be able to drive very successful growth. So when you talk about a growth hacking framework, so everyone likes to do funnels. I stole a funnel from a website of Chris Bowman, who likes to blog a lot about growth hacking. But you might say that there's 5 kind of distinct stages to what growth hacking is. One is acquisition, bringing in new users. Acquisition is probably one of the more well-developed sense of in internet marketing. Acquisition's been around a while. It used to be all this, pay-per-click and things like that. These days, it's more things like import your address book and send out invites. Activation, then, is getting someone to use your product. Anyone who's built an app probably has seen, that's brought on users, probably seen you can get a lot of registrations, but do those registrations actually start using your app? And that's why, indeed, when talking to startups, when talking to companies, when talking to developers, if a company ever puts it out there and says, hey, press release, we have 100 million registrations, so what? How many active users do you have? The difference between a registration and an active user is activation. So that's a key stage of growth hacking, because if you just have registrations, but you don't activate those users, you're not going to be able to drive growth from them. Once you've activated a user, then it's all about engagement. How can you get them to use your product more, to actually embed your product inside of their lives? Once they've done that, then you can start talking about virality. How do you get them to share your product, share your app, share the experiences that you're creating for them? And then another very important stage of growth hacking is resurrection. How do you bring back users that have left? Because that's a common case with apps, with development. You'll get a lot of users, they'll try it out, they might not get to that aha moment, and off they're gone. And at that point, they're just taking up good username space, they're making it more difficult for other users to get a good username, and they're not bringing you any value. So resurrection's a key part of growth hacking. So everyone likes to draw a funnel. I mean, there's sales funnels, there's marketing funnels, there's a growth hacking funnel, which are just these different stages. And one way to think of growth hacking is you're stacking up these different stages within the funnel, and you want to put more stacks in there. In my engagement section, how can I put more stacks in there that are going to drive more engagement? In my acquisition part of the funnel, how can I put more stacks in there that is going to drive more acquisition for me? And all the way down the funnel, you want to add more stacks into that. And that's all about planning and experimentation. So when you're starting to plan your growth hacking means, your tests, what you want to do out there, there's some number of questions answered, and I've listed a few of them there, like how to increase the rate of signups or acquisitions. I mean, yeah, you can buy pay-per-click ads on Google. That gets pretty expensive. Or you can give You can ask users to import address books. I mean, that's been a phenomenal one. I mean, I think the real proof point in the Valley a few years ago was when Facebook went out and started acquiring all the companies that were making address book importers, just to keep them away from all their potential competitors out there. That was something they understood much quicker than a lot of other people. How do you then quickly activate your users? And when you talk about activating the users, you usually want to set some kind of framework. We want to activate your users within N number of days. An N number of days is usually like 1 day, 5 days, 9 days, 10 days, something like that. I mean, you don't usually hear a growth pattern, or we want to activate our user within 6 months. Usually 6 months would be something more like a resurrection rather than an activation. And what are the levers we can pull? What are the knobs we can turn? What can we do within our app that will actually influence this engagement and drive to more retention? And then, of course, there's resurrection. How do we reach users that came and used the app and aren't coming back anymore? So those are the questions asked in growth hacking planning. From that, when you start to answer those questions, you can build your funnel, identify these levers, and often, really when it comes down to it, a lot of these levers are messaging, sending out some kind of message. So then it's what are those messaging points? Identify those messaging points, and you start to have a real growth hacking framework. I said this before, growth hacking is an analytical endeavor. It's creating these plans, thinking, okay, these are 10 different ways we've brainstormed that we think we might drive better engagement. Let's test them out. Twitter is very famous for experimentation. We have a core value that we call bias to yes. And then one of the implementations of bias to yes is it's very easy to do a 1% experiment. So if at Twitter, if I have an idea and I want to say, I want to test this out and see if this is going to lead to better resurrection or better engagement or wherever it is in the funnel I'm going after, it's very easy to get approval to do a 1% experiment to see how that works. And then, of course, it's a matter of doing the analysis. Experimentation is a very interesting thing. You do a 1% experiment. Usually it doesn't work. You got to go reformulate the experiment, come back, work on it again. And that's a key point, actually, to keep in mind with experimentation, is don't give up if an experiment doesn't work the first time. Usually it won't. But that doesn't mean the mechanism's a failure. It's probably the experiment wasn't formulated right. The old internet adage, test, measure, rinse, repeat, that holds truth for growth hacking too. Measure, analyze, reformulate, go out, try the experiment again, measure and analyze. Now, of course, there are bad experiments, things that don't work. We've certainly had our share of Twitter of experiments we've tried out, and actually they drive less user engagement, or they scare off users and don't resurrect them. They make it harder to resurrect them. Well, okay, that's an experiment to walk away from. But a lot more ambiguous experiments that didn't work out the first time did work out on later times. Something to keep in mind. Another key point of growth hacking is to start to analyze and to make sense of how you're analyzing your users and your behavior is to build a state model. Now, state models can get very complex, but I'm going to give you one of the simplest ones, core and casual. At Twitter, we have a number of different state models, but they all kind of really truly feed into core and casual. And core users are the people coming back every day, living in your app. Casual users are the people that are there once or twice a month, maybe less often. You can have different stages of core and casual, and always I like to say start simple. And a simple one is just core and casual, because when you're doing analysis, casual users and core users will behave very differently. And so if you're mixing them in together and you're doing an experiment and say something that works really well for core users might not work well for casual users and vice versa. So that's a very interesting user state model. Start with a user state model, define what core and casual is, and then start getting more sophisticated over time. At Twitter, we have a proprietary, very advanced state model at this time, but I can tell you it started with core and casual. When you look at the messaging to your users, you always want to ask, why am I messaging core users? Why am I messaging casual users? And those are separate questions, right? Like, for example, at Twitter, we send network digests. These are great tweets you might have missed, sent to you by an email. You can sign up for them and you can get them. Well, guess what? Casual users tend to like this. But if you're a core user and you're in Twitter several hours a day, you don't want to get an email about tweets you missed because you didn't miss any. You saw them all. In fact, it's annoying to a core user to get that. But to a casual user, it's very successful. Now, if you're in your experiment, you had mixed in core and casual and had it separated that, you wouldn't see that. You'd say, not really much effect. Seems to be some good, some bad, can't really make out the numbers. The moment you break out your model into core and casual, oh, wait a minute, yeah. The casual users really do like these network digests of tweets they miss. The core users, though, don't really need them. And so always ask that, okay, we're going to send messaging. Why would a core user want this, and why would a casual user want this? Who here is familiar with cohort analysis? Okay, a few hands. Cohort analysis is another, similar to the user state model, another way of breaking down and making sure you're making good sense of your analysis. And the typical way you do a cohort analysis, most often in how it's done, is you might say users that are 1 month old, like users that joined in January, users that joined in February, users that joined in March, and you'll analyze them in different ways. And that's because as you're changing your app, you might have different effects. So for example, if you're running an experiment and you find out, hey, for our users that joined 6 months ago, or say 3 months ago in January, this had tremendous effect, but for users that joined last month in March, this had no effect. That's cohort analysis. You can, of course, a cohort in itself is just any group of users that have similar characteristics, but most cohort analysis, when it's done in practical terms, is really based on when they joined your app. And so that's another way to break them down. And in fact, at Twitter, I mean, you can see how we started to get more sophisticated in our state models. We have core and casual, and then we had cohorts within core and casual. Core users that joined a month ago, casual users that joined a month ago. And this allows you to really start to make sense of all these experiments, of all this data that you're starting to gather when doing growth hacking experiments. Comparing cohorts over time. Anyone here familiar with Mixpanel and Kissmetrics? Yeah, okay, so these are some of these analytics companies doing pretty well in the Bay Area. I can tell you what they do is cohort analysis, basically. I mean, that's really what their product does. But you don't need a product like that. I mean, cohort analysis can be done in Excel. All right, it would be very simple to do that way. And so there are commercial solutions out there, but you don't need to use them. So kind of two things when you're building your framework for growth hacking: core and casual, and then cohort analysis. And that'll give you a lot of way to see into your data and make a lot of sense of it, rather than just kind of having this mumble jumble of numbers out there. Analyze and measure. I mean, I've said this a few times already, but growth hacking is an analytical endeavor. Define experiments, test out those experiments, see how they do. Analyze those experiments by the cohort, analyze them by your state model, find what works, what changes users. There's a lot of times where we've done experiments at Twitter where we thought, oh, this is going to have a tremendous effect on user growth because it makes sense, it's intuitive, I just naturally know that this will work. And yeah, sometimes it does, but sometimes some things that we thought would have huge improvements on engagement had virtually no effect. And there's been other times where we've done experiments that we thought were going to have very limited effect that had tremendous effect. And so, I mean, intuition is a great guide, and there's certainly a place for intuition in the brainstorming and the planning of growth hacking, but the implementation of growth hacking is an analytical endeavor. So I've mentioned some kind of these different stages. Another thing to do is start to look at engagement models. So if you're going to measure, what are you actually going to measure? So I'm doing this experiment, we've defined some livers, and we want to measure whether someone's more engaged. So what do you actually measure to tell if someone's engaged? Well, say if you're sending them an email message about, say, a network digest of tweets, clicks and opens is a pretty obvious one. If people are clicking and opening, they tend to be engaged. If you have a website, time spent on website is a great one. Session of the session lengths. If you have an app, does the user use your app for 30 seconds or do they spend 10 minutes on average when they're in your app? These are all great things that you should measure. So when you're looking at what to measure, these are some of them. And then there's, of course, defined goals. Like I mentioned that Facebook example of how many friends you have, right? That's a defined goal. If you get to a few hundred friends, you're never going to churn. So that's a defined goal. How can we measure whether this experiment we're doing is going to bring people to that defined goal? So those are some of the kind of basics that get into engagement models. What makes sense for your app, of course, is specific to your app, but I'm just throwing out some ideas there. When you look at engagement and you look at growth hacking, you also have to look at fatigue. And this is something that we do really well at Twitter, I believe, is every experiment we do goes into fatigue models too. And fatigue models are almost the opposite of engagement models, right? It's the opposite, it's the absence of engagement, but even more so, fatigue is almost like a negative sentiment. Oh, and so I mentioned the case sending a core user a network digest of tweets they missed. That actually annoys core users in general because I didn't miss any tweets. Why are you bothering me with a message when I'm already in your app every day and I'm already seeing everything? That's a negative effect. And so that's really important because when you're doing all this experimentation and making changes to your app, you will do things that annoy your users. That's not going to help engagement. That's not going to reduce churn. That's not going to get them to go viral and start sharing your app. So it's important to measure fatigue. One of the real gotchas with fatigue, just to mention, is that fatigue will often in the numbers, failures of your feedback systems can often look like fatigue. So say you're measuring something with JavaScript beacons that you've put on all your web pages and using it to define goals. And then you have a set of users that say have JavaScript beacons blocked. That might look like they're fatigued, but no, that's actually a failure of your feedback mechanism. So that's probably what I've seen in my experience as being one of the main kind of gotchas when it comes to fatigue models, is that it's actually a feedback failure and not fatigue. So that's something to always think about when you're measuring fatigue, when you're building that model. Can a feedback failure actually be influencing and driving this number when it shouldn't be? So something to keep in mind. Virality. virality, I mentioned, is a key point of growth hacking, and I mean, it's really giving some people something to share. Right, and what it is that people want to share is going to be very dependent on your app. I mean, Pinterest had incredible growth because people like to share pins. It was naturally viral, and so they made it really easy to share pins in a very different ways. Virality is giving your users something to share and then giving them an easy mechanism to share that. So making it really easy for them to share that. The case of sharing a tweet by email is one of that. Our users wanted to share tweets. Let them make it really easy to include a tweet in an email and send that out. Now, of course, whenever you're starting to build and test viral loops, make sure you're actually tracking, how this gets shared. And so there's different ways to do that. But make sure you track the virality what you can, because if you're not tracking virality, you don't know if you have a successful viral program. Localization is, I have a slide on that just because it can be a tremendous growth driver. I mean, Facebook is famous for when they went international and internationalized everything. Growth went through the roof. Localization, internationalization, whatever you want to call it, can be a great growth driver. One of the gotchas I see with localization and internationalization, though, is a lot of times people say, oh, we translated our app. We've put it in another language. That's great, and that's definitely a requirement for localization, but is that enough? Sometimes, but a lot of times localization means more than just translation. It means actually adapting your app to the markets you're going after that you're trying to localize to. So something to keep in mind. It's always, I mean, you're not going to do it if you don't translate to the local languages, but it's often more than just translating to the local languages. Make your apps fast. That's another point that almost should go without saying these days. I mean, Google has put out multiple studies that have shown that fast apps get more usage. And when we're talking about differences, we're talking like 100 milliseconds. Amazon has this famous study that they put out. I actually have some you can find some of the research on this at a company called Strange Loop Networks, but they did all this testing with Amazon. And what they found is that every time Amazon slowed down their site by 100 milliseconds, they lost $1 million in revenue. And this was like 5 or 6 years ago. I mean, in today's, that would probably be many times a multiple of that. So a slow app, people just don't have patience for it anymore. So make sure you make your apps fast. One of the last points I want to make on growth hacking is to respect your users. When you get into this mindset of, oh, we want to drive more growth, we want to bring users back, that's great, but don't get too selfish. Don't start doing things that are going to annoy your users. Don't start becoming a spammer, because that can work for a little while. I mean, if you start spamming your users with very different kinds of messaging, you'll probably see an initial spike. Oh, great, users are coming in. But if you continue on those kind of paths, they always tend to backfire. Don't spam your users. Just fundamentally respect them. Remember, your users are giving you their time, their money, whatever it is, when they're using your app. And so make sure you respect that and kind of think about that. There can be experiments you'll find that will drive user growth, but is that respecting your users? Indeed, at Twitter, one of our core values is respect the user's voice. And in pretty much every decision we make, we're always asking ourselves, is this respectful to the user to make this change? Is this something that's respecting what they want? Yeah, so that's a kind of growth hacking in a nutshell. And I think I kind of haven't used up any of my time, so I don't know if there's any questions out there in the audience. Are there microphones we could use for the questions?
Great. Thank you for the great talk. My name is Titus from Hong Kong. And actually, the question is on your last slide. Twitter, personally, I feel, has always done a very good job of respecting me as a user and not hijacking my address book. And there are a number of mobile-focused companies, in particular, that have gotten negative coverage in the press for doing exactly that. The obvious question is, why do you think they're crossing the line so aggressively? And then, for you as a company and for the ecosystem in general, is there a downside that other people are doing this and therefore just making users more cynical? Oh, yeah. And can how do you almost self-police as an ecosystem? Thank you.
Yeah, a great question. For the first part of that question, why do people kind of go down this road of not respecting users? I mean, I can tell you what it's like to be in a room where you've kind of been tasked, where you're a group growth team and you've been tasked with, you need to drive this many new users. And that's really what you're focused on. You're focused, you're doing all these experiments. You see it, all these experiments you've gone through, they fail, they don't really bring out growth. And then you do one and, oh, whoa, great, this just brought in a whole bunch of users. This is awesome. And you're excited. But does that really respect the users? No, but the growth is so good. I mean, it's a tough temptation. It's difficult. I often like to say that apps today, as an app developer, you have a lot of power. But with great power comes great responsibility. And so don't be corrupt. I mean, don't be an app dictator. Be more of an app democracy or something like that, and respect your users. And getting to the second point, yeah, we have that concern that certainly there are misbehaving apps out there that respect their users less, that do spam and things like that, and they are ruining the ecosystem for all of us. I mean, often they'll take the brunt of that when it comes crashing in. I can think of one social network in particular, I won't mention them, that decided to really go heavy on the SMS spam, and even maybe did a bit of robocalling. You guys maybe can Google that and figure out who I'm talking about. But I mean, they had tremendous backlash for that, but it also made the whole industry look bad. And so that's why I close with this point, is I'm hoping you'll do good, and I'm hoping you'll benefit our industry rather than bring negative to the industry. Are there any other questions?
Thank you, Mr. Arborin.